Okay, we're back taking a look at the Hardy-Weinberg equation and to talk about what it is and why it's significant. Sometimes people get involved in the formula and spend a lot of time with the formula. You'll see that in the textbook. And go ahead and do make sure you can understand what the formula is. But I always worry that people get involved in a formula and miss the big picture about what it is that we're really talking about. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about it and why it's a very significant way to look at evolution. So one of the things we want to take a look at is the evolution of a population. And Hardy-Weinberg is asking questions about evolution of a population. So just reminding you a little bit about what we talked about before. What is a population? And the idea is that it's an interbreeding group of individuals. So they're capable of breeding with each other. And of course, fertile offspring. And they're in some local region. Okay? So interbreeding and within a specific region is really the hallmarks of a population. So what's the gene pool? Well, of that population, the gene pool, we said, and we did this already, is that it's, as it says, all the alleles for all of the genes in a population. So it's all the variety of all the different types of things you can get. So you might think about it as a catalog, or maybe Amazon, and just think about what are all the things that you could order at Amazon. That would sort of be the gene pool of Amazon. We also said before that if for a pair of genes, so two chromosomes, if the allele is the same on both chromosomes, so that's homozygous, if it's that way for every member of the population, that means there's no chance for variety. There's not going to be any effect. So if you, for example, played around with a deck of cards and pulled out all of the hearts, so that would be 13 cards that are hearts. And then you shuffled those 13 cards that are all hearts. No matter what you deal out, it would only be hearts, okay? Because there's no chance that you're not going to get anything that isn't a heart, okay? It's not possible. They're all the same. They're all hearts, okay? So this would be a bad thing if a gene is fixed in a population, because it means everybody's going to get that. On the other hand, genes sometimes get fixed, which are really important. And so it's been important that everybody have one of those things, whatever it is. Okay? So, except for mutations, there are not going to be any changes if they're fixed for a particular gene. All right, what's Hardy-Weinberg? Hardy-Weinberg, so here 112 years ago, Hardy-Weinberg, these two people, were trying to figure out what would cause evolution in a population. Now, what's kind of interesting is they came down with 5 things that we're going to look at later on, one at a time. But imagine there are 5 factors that are affecting something. So experimentally, if you wanted to figure out what the role was of each factor, what you do is compare 2 groups in which they differed only by one of those 5 factors. So what Hardy-Weinberg is trying to do is figure out what are the conditions that cause evolution, cause change. By the way, this is not always going to be good change. This could be bad change too, all right? So what are the factors that cause evolution of a population? And they worked it down to 5 different factors. And what they said was that if none of those factors are in place, then evolution will not occur. So evolution, I'll say that positively now, evolution will only occur if one of those or more of those 5 factors are changing. So what we want to do is take a look. All right. So if all of these factors are held the same, there would be no evolution. And what would that mean? That would mean that the frequencies of alleles and thus the genotypes that are in a population will stay the same from generation to generation. The only difference is that with each generation there will be different combinations of those same traits, but it'll all still be the same. So again, this is like shuffling a deck of cards, and in that shuffled deck of cards you keep shuffling, but you still have the same cards, okay? And so if there is no evolution of the population, it's said to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So we have no evolution, okay? So if from one generation to the next, the frequencies of alleles, and thus the genotypes, if they all remain constant from generation to generation, then there's no evolution. We had said that evolution, genetic evolution of a population, is a change in the frequencies of alleles from one generation to the next. And what kind of evolution might that be? Well, if there are different alleles for hair length, and we go back and think about organisms that are in a colder environment, we would expect that those organisms that have longer hair, so alleles for longer hair, would be more likely to survive and reproduce. And so if there's evolution of that trait, we would expect that after several generations, the frequency of the alleles for the long hair will increase. The frequency will increase. There will be more and more organisms carrying alleles for long hair after more and more generations. And that would be evolution. So we're back to the shuffling of the deck. What Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium would be is that you continue to shuffle the deck, but you have all the same cards. So if the same cards are simply dealt with different combinations, the cards are all staying the same, and no evolution would occur. So what we're trying to do, like the deck of cards, is to figure out how we can change the ratio. And right now, I hope you all know about decks of cards. There are traditionally, so a regular 52 card deck, like they would be using at Las Vegas. It has 4 suits: hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs. And each of those suits has 13 cards. So again, for those of you that had calculus, 4 times 13 would be 52. Okay, so that's the cards. And we're saying that no matter how many times you shuffle the cards, there still are 13 of each suit for a total of 52. And in that analogy, there would be no evolution. So again, what Hardy-Weinberg is trying to describe is a population that is not evolving. It's just reshuffling those alleles. And what Hardy-Weinberg was trying to show was, what is it that you need to stop or prevent to keep evolution from not happening? And therefore, if you identify the things that you have to hold steady, you've then identified the things that cause evolution. Okay? So we're going to take a look at what that is. So if any of these principles that we're about to look at is causing change, then that would cause the species to evolve. But a reminder, it's not always positive. Okay? What we're going to look at could be a cause of evolution, but not necessarily one that leads to an increased survival of the species. So we would be disrupting the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to cause evolution. Okay? The disruption of the Hardy-Weinberg would cause evolution. And Lucy's all excited running by. She must have seen something. All right. So, where would we go to find a population that is not evolving? Well, we think nowhere. We think populations are always evolving. So meeting all 5 of these Hardy-Weinberg conditions for not evolving, well, we don't think that really occurs. let's take a look at what these 5 conditions are now, which are important and which cause biological evolution. Okay? So mutations cause biological evolution. For no evolution to occur, there would have to be no mutations. Random mating. So if organisms preferentially mate, they would be causing evolution. So for a population to not be evolving, they'd have to mate randomly. Number 3, for a population to not evolve, it would need to remain very, very large. What we see is small populations are more likely to be evolving. No gene flow, so there's no exchange of genetic material between populations. If there is, that's going to cause then some evolution. And finally, if there's no evolution, then there would be no natural selection. That's one of the other conditions. So this is all stated in the negative. That is, these are the things that have to happen. There has to be no mutations. There has to be random mating for no evolution to occur. So this is a bit of a double negative. We can now state the opposite, and we're going to go through these one at a time. If there are mutations, then there would be evolution. If there is preferential mating, then there would be evolution. That's what we're going to go through one at a time. Okay? So, this is going to be important. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. It's all described in your textbook, and you're expected to know all of these really, really well because, well, the title of the class is Evolution, and these are the 5 major causes of evolution. So that would seem to be kind of important. Who knows? Maybe even for the comprehensive final. All right, we're doing one at a time. Mutations. We talked about mutations already. What are they? It's a change in the DNA molecule itself. It's likely affecting the bases, so the nucleotides are changing, and that's ultimately going to change the codons, and that ultimately might change what amino acids are used in proteins. When we have mutations, I think we've mentioned before that most mutations do not help. Most mutations are like a typo. So think about what's the likelihood that you have a typo in a paper that you write, and by making that mistake, you actually have improved the paper. I'm a little confused about what that would be, but in any case, you wind up with a different word, and somehow that turns out to be a better word. Neil Campbell, sadly, died. In fact, while I was working on the project earlier on, I did work with Neil Campbell. Not directly, but we worked on the same projects and the same chapters and kinds of things. And Neil was in his 50s, in good health, but as I understand it, he had a family history of heart disease. And even though he took care of himself, his genetics, I think, did him in, and he died of a heart attack. In any case, Neil Campbell, a very excellent teacher and wonderful writer and contributor, of course, to the title of your book and the first, well, actually many editions. Campbell wrote once, and I remembered it. Take a look. So you got to think, anybody have a car and it's not running so well, and you think, yeah, I know what I need to do. I need to improve this car. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking I should take it someplace with an auto mechanic who knows something about that car and see if they can fix it. I'm going to guess that most of you don't think, yeah, I think what I should do is shoot it. I should actually get a bullet and shoot my car, and that'll fix it. Most likely, shooting a bullet into your car, in case you're wondering what that might look like, shooting a bullet into your car is not the best way to improve engine performance. Is it possible? Well, we had some conversations about this, and I think there is a remote way, but you might want to ask Dr. Bray about this, that this could improve engine performance. But I'm not the guy to give you that answer. So most mutations are like that bullet going into a car. It's not going to help the car. Right? We talked about already the impact of mutations on evolution. And I hope you remember that we said it's the reshuffling of genes from one generation to the next that really is the variety that provides the immediate adaptation. The changes that we see from one generation to the next is mostly caused then by the reassortment of genes in sexual reproduction. It is not mutations. So I was giving you an example in the lecture before this, which was the first lecture for exam 4, that in Haiti there may be someone who has a mutation that conveys extra resistance to SARS-CoV-2, which is that disease, the virus that's causing the disease COVID-19. That's our pandemic that we're dealing with right now. So imagine that someone in Haiti has a mutation that really helps them become resistant. Does that help humanity in the short term? And the answer is no. So that's this point. Over 20 to 100 generations, mutations do not have much impact. And the reason is because most members of the population do not have that mutation. It would take many generations of that mutation conveying advantages and making their offspring more likely to survive and reproduce before that mutation might become widespread enough in a population to have a significant impact on the species. So, mutations are not likely to be the help that a species needs in a matter of a few generations. But over the long term, by the way, mutations can introduce variety. And like our deck of cards, it would be an introduction of a fifth suit, if that was squares or whatever. Now, what causes mutations? Well, mutations are caused by lots of things. Mutations might be a result of radiation of one form or the other. Ultraviolet light from the sun is one of the ways that we are seeing mutations in our skin. So our skin might be mutations leading to cancer. There are chemicals that are called mutagens, and these are pretty serious. These are the kind of things that chemically are actually altering DNA. And so you might know them as a carcinogen. Well, a carcinogen is something that causes cancer, and mutations are often parts of the pathway leading to cancer. So some mutagens are carcinogens. And then DNA is simply copied all the time. That's how we make more chromosomes, and we need those chromosomes for more cells. So we're always copying our DNA somewhere in our body, and in that copying process, there are mistakes that are made. Now, the good news is we have other mechanisms that catch mistakes. Excellent. But sometimes those proofreading kinds of things go wrong. And you might see that in some of my tests, where even though I've proofed them and gone over them, I still have typos or other kinds of errors that come through, and you see them when you take the test. So, mutations caused by lots of different things generally aren't positive, but here, over the long period of time, they are the source of new things, not combinations, but new ones. Okay? So a second condition of Hardy-Weinberg is that when organisms mate, they truly mate randomly. So imagine that in all of humanity, right, everybody's name or their assigned a number is written down, and you want to find out who you're going to have kids with. So first of all, we can agree that it'll be the opposite sex. But then it is truly random. So you are as likely to have children with someone from China as you are as someone from Venezuela, right? Or someone from South Africa, right? And I don't think that that's really the case. Is mating really random? Well, I think that this is one case where it's very easy to imagine that we are not meeting the Hardy-Weinberg condition. Clearly, you're more likely to mate with people who live in your part of the world. Now, one way that you might mate with someone who's from a different part of the world is you might meet them at a college or a university. Large universities, especially those with graduate programs, large graduate programs, frequently attract students from all over the world. So I've mentioned before that when I was at Carbondale and Washington State University, especially Carbondale, which was very international, most of my friends were actually not U.S. citizens. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting, getting to know people from all kinds of other parts of the world. So I took a trip. I once drove to Florida, and in my car, in the back seat of the car, during the Iran-Iraq war, was in my back seat someone from Iran and someone from Iraq. In the front seat was someone who was a member of the PLO. PLO is an organization, Palestine Liberation Organization, that represents Palestine, which, of course, some of the territory was used to make Israel. And so Israelis and the Palestinians are sometimes, or I guess still, are in conflict, leading to violence. So, what are the chances that I would meet and mate someone from very far away? Well, it took those special circumstances, all of this to tell you that in order to have a partner, a sexual partner, somebody you're going to reproduce with, from a place very unlike here, is an effort. That's my point. We are much more likely to have children with people who are most close to us. And maybe that means they're more like us, and maybe that makes us more likely to have babies with them anyway, and to have families. Nonetheless, Hardy-Weinberg's condition is that you'd have to have random mating. And in fact, most mating is not random. Okay. So proximity certainly would make a difference, I said already. And assortative mating, which is your personal preferences, would make a big difference, and that's what we see. So the third condition is genetic drift. Now, what we said before was the condition of Hardy-Weinberg was very large populations. Maybe that's certain kinds of fish that are in the ocean. Those would be large populations unless we start fishing them or destroying their habitat or changing the climate and then destroying their habitat. In any case, what happens when we have small populations? Now, this is, again, something that's very important for conservation. So pay attention, and I'm going to give you some examples. In fact, one example used in your textbook is about Illinois. So let's pay attention. What is genetic drift, first of all? Genetic drift is this random shift in the frequency of alleles simply due to chance. Okay? So I think most of you might, I hope you remember, that we did a little experiment in zoology where we rolled dice. We tried to roll sixes, and you might remember, what did we do to try to be lucky, to make us more likely to roll a 6? And what did we do? We blew on the dice. Okay? So it was that experiment. And you might remember that in pairs, you rolled 30 times, and then you indicated how many 6s that you got with and without blowing. And you might remember that some pairs were way more lucky to get 6s if they blew, and other pairs were way less likely to get 6s if they blew on them. But, so we got those biased results that were way different than 50-50. In some cases, you were 2, maybe even 3 times as likely to roll a 6, and then it depended on whether or not it was blowing or not blowing. And yet we would expect that just based on odds, it should be 50-50. So we found big differences in those pairs, but when we pooled all our data, so that's the large population, we saw that it averaged out closer to 50-50. So if you simply take a small sample of a large population that small sample may not be representative of the entire population. Okay? So small populations can deviate greatly. Some of you may not know that this actually applies to why health insurance is more expensive if you're in a small group. So I'm going to guess that most of you haven't experienced this yet, but if we keep private health insurance in your years ahead, some of you will pay a whole lot more than you would if you were in a great big group health plan, or if the United States simply overall did health care. So Medicare, when you turn 65, is government insurance. And right now, everybody over age 65 gets government insurance. So there's a debate going on here in the year 2020 about whether or not everybody should get government health insurance. And what's funny to me is people who say, oh, I don't want that government health insurance. And then I said, so you're going to turn down Medicare when you're 65? Oh, no. Well, that's government health insurance. It's just right now, everybody gets it if you live long enough. And so the Democrats are putting forward the argument that, well, how about instead of at age 65, it simply is at birth, and then we do it then. And we'd have to change how we finance, and there's going to be lots of other changes, and that's what people are talking about. But if everybody's pooled together, then from year to year, there isn't a big difference in who was sick and who wasn't, because we're all pooled together. But little old Blackburn has long been a small group of about 100 people who are insured. And in years that we've had some very expensive medical emergencies, the next year our insurance premiums went up because suddenly our small group became expensive. We became one of the extremes of small size, just like the big differences that we found in DICE. So small groups often pay more than a big group. And one of the things Blackburn did in the year 2020, this year, is we shifted to a large group because Blackburn's associated with the Presbyterian Church. The whole Presbyterian Church has tens of thousands of people. I think actually it's hundreds of thousands of people. And so we got to be part of that group, and lo and behold, we're paying less for insurance and getting more benefits. These are all huge things for you ahead when you get those high-paying jobs and careers that we hope that you get. We also hope you're really happy. All right, let's talk about these small population sizes that tend then to deviate. Just like with health insurance, they tend to deviate, okay? So imagine that we have a population that's got a good size, so that number here, so this height is population size, we have a lot. And then something happens. I mean, it could be an asteroid hit the Earth, it could be, for a particular population, could be an oil spill, could be a company now, for whatever reason, decides to dump a bunch of pollutants, and in that stream that's affected, the number of the individuals drops down very, very low, okay? We'll show you examples, but this could be bison in the United States, this could be California condors, this could be black-footed ferrets. I'm going to talk about all of these, okay? And then we come in for whatever good purpose, and we're able to address this. We're salvaging this low population here, and we're helping them all to recover. And the question is, how are these populations here in these time zones different from these populations? And even though the numbers might be about the same, the genetic diversity is much less. Why? And so this is a figure that they use and happened, we think, in cheetahs. Take a look here, and here we see lots of diversity in color of these little dots. And now we have a small sample size of just 4. And you can see that these 4 couldn't possibly represent all of the diversity up here. There's not enough dots here. But if these dots represent the genetic diversity at this point, now when the population increases again, it's simply a lot of whatever was here. And that's the bottleneck. That's the term bottleneck that we're talking about. So a genetic bottleneck is where a population is reduced low, so reduced population size, And now there's a shift in the frequency of alleles. And as the population recovers, there's a limited number of alleles here. Okay. Lots of different ways for you to think about this. Another way is humanity. So in all of humanity, we speak different languages and different dialects. In fact, I think over the last 10,000 years, there had been more dialects and more languages, and that we're losing them. Imagine that all of humanity gets reduced down to Central America. That's it. For some reason, only people in Central America survive. And then those people multiply and spread all throughout the earth again. Well, the people that are multiplying from just the remaining Central American population would only be speaking probably those languages and those dialects. Okay, because nobody here was speaking Russian. Nobody here was speaking French, maybe. I don't know. There might be French-speaking people in Central America. I'm sure there are, actually. In any case, we reduce the diversity in the bottleneck, and then the recovery is only an increase in numbers. The diversity is still reduced. So the diversity is still reduced, but the numbers might be recovering. And we think that happened in cheetahs. Here's another way to show that. Diversity, then we dump out a few, and are the balls that we selected out here reflective of this diversity? Well, in one case, we don't have any yellow, so we could just be missing stuff that we had before. We may also have a shift in the frequency. So here you can see there's 5-to-1 ratio of blue balls to white, but over here it does not look like a 5-to-1 ratio of blue balls to white. It looks more like an even 50-50 ratio. All right, well, what's happened in real wildlife and its real problems today? In Illinois, we lost a lot of prairie. My wife and I often are traveling or hiking around Illinois. In fact, we might be hiking around our house. We did that yesterday. And we were going into some of the floodplain of Macoupin County Creek with the dogs and Zoe and Lucy. I guess that'd be Louie if they're one. Zoe and Lucy went down to Macoupin County Creek, and we threw some sticks in, and they both jumped in and got the sticks, and they had a lot of fun. And as we were walking around in this hilly region next to Macoupin County Creek, we imagined, what if those farm areas, which were not big, what if those farmed areas were all prairie? What would this place look like? Well, prairie is great diversity. And with great diversity of plants, often comes great diversity of animals. Animals that feed on that diversity, or animals that live within that diversity, or animals that reproduce within some of those diverse environments. Well, people came through Illinois, and Illinois got changed. So where we used to have great big, prairies, and I don't want to call them fields of prairie, great big prairies, plains of prairies, that rich soil got plowed under, and now we grow mostly koi beans, soybeans and corn. I guess together that would be koi beans. So we got Lucy and Zoe and corn and soybeans. There we go. We're going to keep it straight. In any case, we get rid of the habitat, and guess what? We get rid of an awful lot of the things that lived in the habitat. And so that's prairie chickens. And in prairie chickens, when we take a look at those that are surviving, we see that they had very low levels of genetic diversity, and that was correlated with a very low hatching rate of the eggs laid by the remaining Illinois prairie chickens. So here's a figure right out of your textbook. This is the 10th edition, but I think it's in the 11th. This is giving you a feel of where all that prairie was, and realize that Blackburn College is right up here. So we're in the heart of that prairie. This is largely the Illinois River Plain coming down, so that's a floodplain here. This is Shawnee National Forest down here, so it was not traditionally prairie, but you can see Illinois was very much the prairie state. And now look at where we see reductions of prairie, and we have some other places with prairie and some places where we're returning prairie. But these are the places where we know there are prairie chickens in Illinois. So here's a figure, again from the 10th edition, but I think it's in the 11th, comparing Illinois prairie chickens and then those prairie chicken populations in Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Now the good news is that down here in Kansas, they still have about 750,000 prairie chickens. That's wonderful. And so Kansas is one of the few places that has large numbers of prairie chickens. In 1993, we were reduced in Illinois to fewer than 50 prairie chickens. And when we had fewer than 50 prairie chickens, look at the diversity. So this is number of alleles per gene, per locus, 3.7 on average. And you can see the genetic diversity was much greater where we had larger numbers. So in the 1930s and 1960s, we had much greater genetic diversity. I'm going to guess that that diversity was measured on skin or other specimens from museums, that they were able to pull that off. This diversity can be measured today, and look at the high diversity that we see with this large population. That's what we're talking about here with Hardy-Weinberg, large versus small populations. And so by having a small population, we lose genetic diversity. And so this is that bottleneck that I was referring to. And then look over here with hatching rates and look at the correlation. So when we have lots of diversity in a large population, we get very high hatching rates. Then as population size starts coming down, we see a reduction. Look at 4,000, we see a reduction in hatching rate. And now, lo and behold, look at the tiny population we had in Illinois, and look at the very low hatching rate. In fact, quite literally, it's half, because it's below 50. It's going to be half of what we see in Kansas. So, small population, loss of genetic diversity, and furthermore, it affects reproduction in this case. How about bison? Well, bison in the United States were very reduced. You can see by about 1900, we had fewer than 1,000. There's all sorts of stories that make me very angry and sad about people shooting bison just for fun. They just go out and shoot them. In some cases, I had heard of people that would just cut out the tongue and eat the tongue of the bison, leaving all the rest to rot. And one of the things that I respected when I was growing up was that Native Americans would work very hard to try to use all of the parts of a bison so that nothing goes to waste, and thus using natural resources in a very responsible fashion. And that's sustainable. That's the kind of native practice that I really admire, which is a way that they could have lived for a long time in a single place and not run out of natural resources. California condors have also gone through a tremendous bottleneck. So here you can see in the early 1980s, California condors were down to, I don't know, there's an exact number, but about 25. And then there's been lots of effort to help them reproduce. My wife and I were able to see, I don't know, about 6 or 7 California condors that were in the zoo in Portland, Oregon. It was really, really neat to see them. And they weigh them regularly, and they had some scales there. And then they'd throw out some dead bodies for them to eat. And it wasn't really something for children to watch because it was pretty gross. I don't know, maybe some kids just need to learn those natural things. But nonetheless, they've got the population all the way up to more than 280, because that's only in 2000, I guess probably 6 right here, if that's 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we're doing fine as far as recovery, but we've lost tremendous genetic diversity. And so that's a bottleneck. Black-footed ferrets, interestingly, were thought to be extinct. And then we discovered them, as you can see, from 85 to 87, we went out and got 18 from the wild. We didn't know that there were any left. And now we've been captively breeding them and reintroducing them into the wild. And here you go from 18 to 3,000. So that's an even greater recovery than the California condors. And so the numbers here are much higher, and we even got to be a little lower than the California condors. But we worry about black-footed ferrets. We worry about California condors. We worry about cheetahs. We worry about bisons, because all of those species have very low genetic diversity. And so if there's going to need to be some new combination or the existence of new alleles to help these species survive, then tragically it may be a virus or a bacterial infection or a fungal infection that could wipe out the whole species. White rhinos, one of the animals that, I don't know, I just really like rhinos. They eat grass, and they just want to be left alone. And they may look grumpy, they're a little nearsighted. They really would just like to be left alone. Well, the white rhinos were reduced down to only about 20 in 1885. About 8,000 in the wild. I'm sure that number's gone down as poaching has taken them. And so it's a real problem. All right, so we said genetic bottlenecks, whether it's rhinos or bison or ferrets or condors. And nonetheless, when their numbers are driven down, it means the diversity has been driven down. And when you change the frequency of alleles in these generations, you are causing evolution. And so genetic drift is one violation of Hardy-Weinberg. Hardy-Weinberg required here that there were large populations. Small populations lead to genetic drift. So I want to be clear here, because we're going to contrast that now with founder effect. With genetic bottlenecks, there had been a large population, and all of the black-footed ferrets, all of the California condors, all of the bison, all of the white rhinos, those numbers in their entire species are driven down. And that's a loss of genetic diversity. But here's another kind of genetic drift. What if we look at a few individuals taking off on their own little adventure, like a few individuals leaving Ecuador, whether they're turtles or finches, and making their way to the Galapagos Islands? In that case, you're starting a new population with just a few individuals, founders. You can think of these as pioneers. Okay? And so you're beginning a new population with a biased sample of the original population. Now, the important thing here is that those founders, those pioneers that are setting up another new population, they leave intact the original population. So when a few finches fly away from Ecuador and get stranded on the Galapagos, we still have an awful lot of finches remaining in Ecuador. When a few little tortoises get stranded and somehow float their way out to the Galapagos Islands, there are still lots of tortoises remaining in South America. Okay? So that's different. Founder effect is this biased sample effect, but it still leaves essentially intact the founding population, the main big population. All right. Well, so if you watch much really old TV, the kind of thing from my generation, Gilligan's Island might come to mind. So here we've got a few people that took off on a 3-hour tour, if you know the song, and they get stranded on an island. So here's a picture of the cast. Imagine the genetic diversity of this group. Okay? I'm pretty much thinking that most of you see that this group does not represent humanity's diversity in no way, shape, or form. Okay? We do have males and females at least, but everybody's white, right? And we have, of course, the professor, and we have the rich couple. Now I'm trying to remember who they are. But nonetheless, the Captain Gilligan, of course, and so it's very homogeneous. What would that future population, if instead of getting lost on a 3-hour tour, they were lost in a space capsule and somehow landed on another planet and started another whole population on another planet, you can see that the genetic diversity would be very, very low. So here's what your textbook says. I think it was page 494 in the 10th edition. You'll have to find it. I'm sure it's very close. Genetic drift is most significant in small populations. That's where it happens. Causes these allele frequencies to change at random because whatever alleles are lost, it's just chance of which individuals weren't selected, which ones didn't fly away, which ones were killed by hunters. And so it's mostly random. And that leads to this loss of genetic variation. It can cause some alleles that aren't most beneficial to be fixed. You lost the diversity, and so now, back to my restaurant analogy, everybody gets French fries instead of a choice of French fries and baked potato. Okay. And French fries every day is not a good idea. All right, what about the fourth condition of Hardy-Weinberg? And this is gene flow. This is the exchange of genetic information between populations. Okay. So that's what this says right here. So how is it that genetics gets transferred between populations? Well, it's the movement of fertile individuals that are going and having babies with members of another population, or simply in plants, the movement of pollen over great distances. Aphids, if you remember, we said that when they reproduce sexually, there's wings in the sexual forms. And so those wings allow movement that might mean an exchange of genetic material from one area of aphids to another, one population to another. So, we said mixing it up, a reshuffling of genetics is one of the most important mechanisms of generating diversity for immediate evolution. From one generation to the next, it's one of the most important. And one of the ways to really mix it up, possibly even introducing new traits that might be necessary for survival, would be gene flow. So if it turns out that the deer in one state park are suffering from some kind of disease, but the deer in another state park seem to be doing fine in similar circumstances, it might be that the deer that are doing well have an allele that is conveying an advantage. And that allele might be shared with the deer population that is suffering if fertile individuals, fertile deer from the healthy population, are able to migrate over to the population that's having problems and then have babies that inherit those more positive alleles. That would be gene flow. Okay. Hardy-Weinberg said there's no gene flow. For no evolution to happen, there has to be no gene flow. So, gene flow, as you can see here, tends to reduce differences. Populations might, we might have a mutation arising in one population, and then through gene flow, through organisms reproducing from one population to the next, they move that new trait, that new allele, to another population. So it reduces differences. We'll see later on when new species form, it's because they are not sharing any of these accumulated new traits. And so that's going to cause them to drift apart. They'll become more and more different when they don't share the new stuff. They'll accumulate new stuff, and they'll accumulate more and more differences. So gene flow is pretty important. There are things, if we wanted to, I could go for a while talking about arranged marriages. And we did a little bit when we talked about mating strategies that we had time for this semester. Good for us. In arranged marriages, it's frequently the case that people who lived in one village would arrange a marriage with a mate for their child from another village. You didn't mate, you tended not to mate with someone from your own village. And that's probably because the people in a village are more closely related to each other. So I see that as a deliberate attempt to increase some genetic diversity, that you would arrange a marriage with someone from another population, one that's nearby, but nonetheless a different population than the one you came from. And that's gene flow. So we've looked at 4 of the 5 Hardy-Weinberg conditions. We said that for Hardy-Weinberg conditions to be met, in which there would be no evolution, so for no evolution to happen, you can't have any mutations. You have to mate randomly. Populations need to stay very, very large, and populations do not exchange genetics with nearby or other populations within the same species. So populations keep their own genetics to themselves. Okay. Violations of any of these then are going to be things that are going to cause evolution. But now the big question: which of the above, violations of which of the above, so if you had mutations, if you had preferential mate choice, if you had small populations, or you did have gene flow, which of those is naturally going to increase fitness, which means it's going to make the population more likely to survive into the next generation? And the mutations certainly are not necessarily good. Preferential mating could lead to some adaptive mating, and the population could possibly be more likely to survive if, for example, females were fussier about their mates and happened to pick healthier males to mate with. That would be a positive thing. Extremely small populations, how is that ever going to be a helpful thing? Well, I'm struggling to think how that's going to be helpful. And a population that stays all by itself is usually a population destined for extirpation, which means it's not going to exist in that region anymore. Okay. So in general, these first 4 conditions of Hardy-Weinberg are not things that lead to evolutionary success. They're things that cause change in the frequency of alleles from one generation to the next, but not necessarily adaptive change, which is a positive, a survival mechanism. The 5th condition of natural selection, well, that one helps. Here's the section title from your textbook. Natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. The very nature of natural selection is something that's favoring traits that promote survival and reproduction. It's also responsive to the current conditions. And so it improves the chances that the species will survive. This is huge. This slide's really important. So, one way to think about natural selection is different degrees of success, so differential success, different degrees in successfully reproducing. Oftentimes people think of natural selection as simply survival. They think about whether or not you get eaten or whether or not you simply die and you never get to reproduce. And that is the case in acorns. So if you think about all the acorns from an oak tree, most of those acorns don't make it to reproduce at all. They die before they get to that stage. Or tadpoles that are hatching out right now from all the different frogs breeding in our area in this early April, spring. But in many cases, organisms do make it to reproduction, and it's how well they reproduce, how many babies they produce that in turn are going to survive and reproduce themselves. Okay? That's the differential success in reproduction. And that means that some alleles are more likely to be passed on to the next generation than others. Those alleles, of course, are those that are adaptive. So here, some important statements. You have them right here. Natural selection is matching the organism to its current environment. It's not anticipating change. It's simply favoring those organisms that are best suited for the current conditions. We talked about this before, because natural selection is acting under the current conditions, not something that used to be, and not something that might be, but instead what is. We said that what is adaptive is always relative to the conditions of the environment. And we talked about this when we looked at our bean experiment. So we went out and looked for beans outside, and we saw that some colors and sizes of beans were easier and some were more difficult to locate. But we also noted that that was kind of a brown, not much green, but a brownish grass environment. But if it had snowed the night before, and if we had a couple inches or more of snow on the ground, well, then what beans and what type of beans that would have been most difficult to find would have changed. And that was then whatever bean was best suited for the environment when we were doing our experiment was relative to the conditions. So we talked about that idea of better or improvement. And we said that that idea of evolution making things better or improving is only relative to whatever the current conditions are. So I introduced that Red Queen hypothesis. And that Red Queen hypothesis was, let's go back, the Red Queen hypothesis was that you have to change just to keep up. That as the environment changes, evolutionary change is necessary just to maintain. It isn't that the species somehow is prospering better than it was before. It might just be that evolutionary change is necessary to survive, to maintain. And that was the story in the Red Queen. So once again, genetic drift, gene flow don't necessarily lead to this adaptive evolution because it has to do with a match between the organism and its environment. So, the Campbell book in chapter 23, near the end of the chapter, does talk about some of the limits of natural selection. And I urge you, and I think as part of your objectives, to take a look at those limitations of natural selection. So one of the limitations is that what gets remodeled, just like me talking about my father making the skateboards, what gets remodeled is based upon what you inherited. So when we went down to the shop and tried to make a skateboard, we were limited to what we had on hand. So when we remodel in evolution, it has to do with what traits the organisms inherited from their ancestors. So what traits exist, and then, okay, well, we'll work with that. We don't get to make up brand new materials or parts or processes. So selection is only amongst the present diversity. Another feature important to remember is that no one part of an organism functions by itself. That organisms are a big mixture of lots of functioning parts. And that means that each part has to function in the context of all these other functioning parts. So we had talked before about chewing and hearing. Those are related. Remember that a couple of your ear bones came from the lower jaw. And so there's not a surprise that the joint of your jaw is right near your ear. Well, chewing can lead to noise that can interfere with hearing because those bones in your jaw can transmit vibrations right to your ear that would mask or cover up what it is you're trying to hear. And so that's a functional compromise. I've made the case that there are no perfect adaptations. In fact, I've argued just as well in your life that there are things that will never be perfect either, because everything's a compromise. It's always something in light of the other things that are going on. Okay? So for something to be highly specialized and very good means that it's losing flexibility. It's probably really good at one job, but not so good at the other jobs. So everything's compromised like that, including all the parts that we put together to make us. Chance, natural selection, interact. That's another point they make in the book, and we've looked at that. We said that, yep, natural selection is about the environment, but there are some things that seem lucky. They have natural explanations, but there's no way that the organisms are going to be well adapted for some rare, very rare events, like an asteroid landing near them or on them every 30 million years. Okay, that's simply not going to be an adaptation organisms are going to have. On the other hand, we talked about hurricanes going across Florida, and hurricanes over the last 1,000 years have probably crossed just about every part of Florida in the last 1,000 years. So it could be argued that the plants that are in Florida have adaptations to recover from hurricanes, because at some point in the last 1,000 years, each population has probably lasted through or existed during a hurricane that's caused some kind of damage, and they've had to recover from that. But natural selection is not simply the process we've talked about. There are these elements of chance. And finally, as we said before, evolution is occurring in the context of current conditions. There is no anticipation. There's nothing that's selected for that, well, it's being favored by the environment, but it's not really anything they need right now. It's just that, like a good toolkit, they're going to need it in about 10 generations. Okay. There's nothing that can do that. Natural selection is simply going to be the favoring of traits that convey advantages today, all right, at the moment. So there's no foresight. Right? The need, as we talked about, doesn't generate any kind of variety that's useful. So, we've said before, because of a lot of the above, life regularly goes extinct. Environments can change faster than species can evolve. It may be a single event, like a fungal infection that's wiped out now almost half of all the frog species, amphibian species on Earth. We've lost almost half. Well, it's approaching that nonetheless. I think about half right now are threatened or have been lost. In any case, by a fungus that's spreading all over the world. It's tragic. And so when I was in New Zealand, it was very, very sad. Species can't evolve quick enough sometimes to survive one or many kinds of threats. And so life goes extinct. That's a regular rule. Okay, moving on to things that are related. First of all, survival of the fittest. It's a phrase that Darwin did not come up with, but when someone else did, he did adopt it. And it's a bit of a problem phrase, because what's it mean to be fit? Well, what it means to be fit is to survive and probably produce a lot of babies. So if fitness is largely about surviving, then what the phrase says is survival of the survivors. And that really isn't very helpful. Okay. So struggle for existence is a pretty good phrase. Descent with modification, that's a phrase that Darwin used. Those are much better. But for the most part, the problem that I'm talking about here has to do with the implication that survival of the fittest, struggle for existence, are all about direct competition amongst individuals. And in fact, reproductive success is much more than fighting with your other members of the same species. It has to do with finding resources. It has to do with staying healthy, fighting off infections. So the biggest hurdle for a species is not the other members of the species. And I think many people think about that. So relative fitness, what is that? Well, it's relative. It's fitness relative to what? It's fitness relative to the other members of the species. So your relative fitness, relatively speaking, how are you doing in this evolution class? Well, relatively speaking, you might be doing better than 90% of the people in the class. And it's not the case, but it could be the case that no one in the class is getting better than a C. So relatively speaking, you could be doing better than most of the class, but the truth is everybody's doing poorly. Okay? So relative is not about absolute success. It's about your success compared to the other members of your species. Another aspect that you ought to bear in mind is that natural selection is, and what we've talked about, is a change in the frequency of alleles from one generation to the next. But you should know that natural selection normally does not select based on genetics. It's not the sequence of bases in the DNA molecule that conveys the advantages. Instead, it's the phenotypes that, in part, are derived from those genotypes. The genotypes, we said, indicate an awful lot of detail about the types of molecules in our body and the way things interact. And those are hugely important. But the ultimate phenotype is also an expression of the environment. And natural selection is acting on the phenotypes, not the genotypes. And that often gets confused. So, just so that instead of just thinking about hawks catching bunnies or a cougar tracking down deer or a lion or a tiger preying on whatever zebra or antelope it can find, let's think instead about examples of relative fitness that are not competition between individuals, but simply are measures of organisms or adaptations that do a better job in the environment, okay? And so here's one. In the Fiji tree frog, it lays its eggs, and those eggs need to stick to leaves. And those eggs need to stay stuck to those leaves until the right time for the eggs to hatch. Okay. Well, how sticky are your eggs compared to everybody else's eggs? And under the current environmental conditions, which is probably a lot of rain, how do your eggs hold up compared to the other females laying their eggs? That's the kind of real challenge that many species face. Right here in our area, frogs, salamanders lay their eggs in lots of temporary water. And so the female is going to be very selective about where she puts her eggs. It's called oviposition, OVI position. And it has to do with where the female lays her eggs. And the female doesn't want to, so they usually attach it to vegetation or a stick. If they attach it to sticks that are right near the surface of the water, and the water level drops before the eggs hatch, well, those eggs would be high and dry above the water and would probably die. If the female lays her eggs then at the bottom, so that as the water level drops, they still are covered by water, they may be more likely to be preyed upon by crayfish or other kinds of critters or bacteria living at the bottom of the pond or the stream. Or it may be that they get covered up with mud or other sediment, and it's very low oxygen, and the eggs don't hatch that way either. So females have to pick an area that's just the right depth, that's unlikely going to fall, the water level fall too much before the eggs have a chance to hatch. And what's neat in our area is that this is something you can go out and see regularly. It's something that I watch for when I go out in springs and look at where salamanders have laid their eggs. And I've done this long enough that I know there are certain places where I'm more likely to find eggs than others. So if the water level in a temporary water area is only about 6 inches deep, I'm not expecting to find salamander or frog eggs there. I find them more when the water level's over a foot deep, closer to 2 foot deep, and the eggs are somewhere within 2 feet of the surface of the water. So it's pretty neat. And you can go out and make measurements of these things. You can measure the depth of the water at those spots, and you can measure then the distance from the bottom and the distance from the top where the eggs are located. These are real kinds of natural history measurements that we can make that are real measurements of the fitness of individuals in their reproduction. So here we're talking about the Fiji frogs and the stickiness, but another aspect of relative fitness is this female laying her eggs in a place that are most likely to survive? In the 31 years now that I've been here at Blackburn, I've seen salamanders lay their eggs in the top few inches of water, and then we had a late freeze that actually caused a frozen layer of water, then ice, at the very, very top, and all those eggs got frozen. And then when it thawed out about a week later, I remember looking at Macoupin County Creek, a floodplain, and there were thousands of amphibian eggs that were all dead because this rare event selected against females that were laying their eggs in the higher parts of this water. It was one of the risks of breeding early in the spring. That's relative fitness, folks. It's not one salamander or frog fighting another, but it's doing things well. It's doing things well under the current conditions. And there are rare events like that freezing event that then can also screw everything up. The most of the time that would have been the good thing to do, but it didn't work then. Here's another example of relative fitness. And that might have to do with snakes, and snakes that might be, in this case, injecting maybe a digestive enzyme. And so their teeth are hollow here, and as they pierce the prey and swallow the prey, a digestive enzyme gets transferred deeply, like marinating a steak. So if you take a steak and put it in a marinade, you might stab the steak with a fork, and that would help to move those enzymes or acids in the marinade deeper into the steak and make it more tender. Here in a snake that we're looking at, it's got fangs that are hollow, and it's able, in this case, to inject something pretty deeply. And our argument, Dr. Cardong's argument, has been that this is a way that, because snakes don't chew up their food, they can actually get digestive enzymes deep inside their prey. So those snakes that were better able to do this would have an advantage over other members of their species. So if there was variation in the tooth shape and variation in the ability to deliver those digestive enzymes deep into their prey, then some snakes of the species would have more advantage than the other. This again is relative fitness. Here's a tadpole. This one, I don't know for sure, is the species that's stream adapted that we looked at in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. This is near Mount St. Helens. And these are called the tailed frogs. And the tailed frogs don't have tails, but it's really a copulatory structure that males have. And the tadpoles live in fast-moving streams. And these tadpoles need to hang on. Now, what you're seeing in the picture are rows of teeth that are really good at scraping off algae. But the mouth is also well adapted for adhering to the rocks so that all the tadpoles don't just get washed downstream. And what was pretty neat about these tadpoles and that species of tailed frog was that you might have trouble finding the adults if you go to the stream, but you could easily find the tadpoles. So you could easily find out what streams had tailed frogs because the tadpoles were stuck to the rocks. Well, some members of the tadpoles, some individuals, are better able to adhere to the rock and also still feed. I imagine that some were really good at adhering to the rock, but somehow couldn't let go and move very easily. Others that could move more easily might not stick so well. So during the most turbulent flow, those that couldn't stick so well would be at a disadvantage. And on the other hand, those that stick really well under very low flow conditions would probably not be able to move so well. These are all the relative fitness characteristics. And I just noticed, didn't point it out ever before, but look at this red patch right here. What do you think that is? And if you guess the heart, you're probably right. It's in the right position for the heart. So here's some of those tadpoles sticking to the rocks. And this is a rock that somebody lifted out of the water because that's not normally the place the tadpole would be. Very funky looking animals, aren't they? Here's more of the relative fitness. So in this particular case, we're looking at a cuttlefish, and it's well adapted to its environment in that it can change its color pattern and match its environment. And there must be variation in how well they can do this. And so that would be relative fitness. Again, it's not combat directly between individuals. It's just a matter of who can do these things better under the current circumstances. Here's another example of relative fitness. And that is a snake here that eats eggs. And when we take a look, some people misunderstand and think that the snake is unhinging its jaws. In fact, it has ligaments here between these bones. And what it's doing is stretching the joint, but it's not unhinging and moving things out. So a snake like this that's eating eggs will be more likely to swallow eggs if it can really distend this jaw and get all the way around the egg. So there would be variation in this, and there must be some individuals that are better able to extend their jaw than others. All right, so those were examples of relative fitness. More things that are in chapter 23 worth talking about. We've talked about changes from one generation to the next. And when we look at the distribution of traits, so distribution of traits, if we look right now at the distribution of height of students in evolution right now, we'd find that there's sort of an average and that it's a bell-shaped curve in which the average, there's more of them, and so that's creating this peak at the top. And then as we move away from the average, both for a shorter height and taller, we see that that number drops, okay? And that's what's called a normal distribution. And what we want to do is show you this figure that's coming up in which we can see three types, that's what you're looking at on the screen, three types of selection that change the normal distribution. That's what we're saying. Three types of directional that change the normal distribution. So here we are at figure 2313. We're looking at mouse color at the top, and we see that normal distribution. And what we're saying is there's a lot of mice that have this intermediate brown color. And then as we get darker and darker, we see fewer and fewer mice, until at the extreme, there's very few mice that are this dark. Likewise, as we go away from the mean, the average up here, and look at lighter colored mice, the number drops until the lightest color mice are in the lowest number. We have the fewest lightest and the fewest darkest, and mostly the medium in intermediate here. And now we have three types of natural selection that can change this normal distribution. Okay? In general, there could be a favoring of darker colored mice. And so simply what we see is this bell curve shifts so that now there's more of the darkest and the darker and of the medium, all of this, and there's very few of the lightest colored. In fact, we might be completely out of this lightest color mouse right here. And that's called directional selection, because we take the normal population and we just shift it towards favoring the darker mice. Now, the second kind of selection here is pretty weird. It means that we have selection against the average. So the result of this is that what was in the middle becomes one of the lower numbers, and we favor the extremes of one extreme or the other. Disruptive selection is kind of interesting of what would cause that. Disruptive selection like this might be that it's helpful to be one of two types. And stink bugs in Illinois fall generally into the brown and green categories. Now, the biologist that it was in Illinois at the time I was in grad school, a guy named Dr. J. McPherson, was in a lab right next to mine. And Dr. McPherson studied these stink bugs, trying to figure out what was the difference between the brown ones and the green ones. And last I had heard, he never really found a difference between the brown ones and the green ones, except that by being maybe, and that's not a stink bug here, but if this is a brown stink bug on this side and a green one over here, predators may develop a search image for the really, really abundant green ones. And so they start looking for green ones and ignore the brown ones. And then what will happen over time, after a few years maybe, is that the green ones are driven down because the predators were eating them. And then some of the predators shift over and start preferring the more abundant brown ones. And the green ones now have an advantage. And so for the next few years, the green population comes back, while the brown population goes down. And so the predators oscillate over the years between the brown ones and the green ones. And that's the kind of selection that favors then the two extremes and not the middle. So if you're kind of brown and green, maybe you're always getting eaten. And that's the argument. Over here, stabilizing selection is one that favors the middle more and more. And so in stabilizing, it's really bad to be at the extremes. And a good example of this is birth weight in humans. So it turns out that somewhere between 6 and 8 pounds is a pretty good birth weight. But if you're much lighter than that, your chances of survival go down. And interestingly, people may not know this, but your chances of surviving go down as well the bigger and bigger the baby is. And it may not only be problems for mom giving birth to such a big baby, but there may also be other health issues that have led to such a large size baby. So what I'm saying is like between 2 and 4 pounds birth weight might be as bad as between 10 and 12 pounds over here. And so that would be what's called stabilizing selection. All right, now a different 3 types of selection. We're looking at different ways to shift a population. We have talked about different versions, really, of natural selection. Natural selection is what's generally going on. Sexual selection, if you remember, because we talked about this with the mating strategy. Sexual selection, instead of the general environment favoring traits, it's the opposite sex that's favoring the traits. So it's selection in the context of mating. And finally, in artificial selection, the agent of selection becomes humans. Now, by the way, the environment is, of course, in action in all of these. A viral outbreak would be affecting natural selection. A virus killing a whole bunch of males and not females would affect sexual selection. And if people are raising farm animals and trying to select new breeds of chickens or cattle, of course a disease will make a difference here. So we're emphasizing that this is human interference, this is the opposite sex here, and this is simply the broader natural environment. Yes, the one of the agents of change is different, but they're all affected by some of these natural factors. So they differ by what or who is doing all the selecting. So this is meant to be a cartoon that's related to sexual selection. And so this female lioness is wise to the tricks. I don't know that that's all that funny. Well, Charles Darwin comes up and documents, makes a case for natural selection, does a spectacular job of that. But for a while, he was puzzled by what was going on in sexual selection. He hadn't figured that out yet. And so this is one of the Darwin quotes. This you can see in 1860. So he's presenting on July 1st, 1858. He presents his idea of natural selection, and then in 1859 publishes Origin of Species. And so at that point, 1860 now, about a year later, he's struggling to come up with this idea of sexual selection. He just can't figure out how this male is in any more fit by having these giant, brightly colored feathers. And then he thinks through sexual selection. Two main types of sexual selection. We haven't talked much about it, so let's just dive a little bit deeper here. It's in chapter 23. There's sexual selection within a sex. So it's males who may be competing with other males for the chance to have sex. That's called intrasexual selection. And it may lead to traits on males who are better able to do things like grab a mate. This is a newt from the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain, Portugal, and even northern Africa and Morocco. And these newts, which I just loved, the males grab the females from below. And so what they do is grab the female from below, grab her by the arms, and then hold on to her to try to keep other males from grabbing a female. So this is called amplexus. And in amplexus, there's not actually sperm transfer going on. It's simply a male occupying a female so that he has her. And he has her to the exclusion of other males, at least he hopes. So that's amplexus. Newts around here in Illinois will also grab a female and hang on to her. Frogs do it all the time. Male frogs will grab onto a female and occupy her. Male frogs, male toads, will tend to grasp anything, and there are cases of male toads grabbing other male toads, and there's a special call that those toads make that's called a release call, and it's meant to be a signal that, dude, you've just gotten another dude. And so both of them are disadvantaged if they're being hugged by another male, because neither one is going to increase their odds of getting a female. So that probably was the selection for the trait that I said was called a release call. So here's again a male who's feeling very fortunate. On the other hand, sometimes males in amplexus, and this is a California or Washington state newt here, they tend to grab a female or grab other males who are grabbing a female. And so they form these kind of mating balls. And this is just ongoing tussling that's trying to get the access to the female. And I'm not sure how these resolve, but mating is not going to go on in this condition. All right. So other things when we think about intra, which means inside, intrasexual selection, we think about male combat. And I'm afraid that too many nature films are going to show males fighting with each other and not show those little amplexus balls of newts and stuff that I think are way more amusing. Anyway, it's usually knocking heads. So here we've got some bighorn sheep that are banging heads. we have one of these skulls that's in the zoo lab, a real skull. And this is another example of combat that somehow is going to indicate superiority and come with access to females. Okay, so that's intrasexual selection. The type of sexual selection that I've referred to most often is intersexual selection. And that's where the opposite sex is doing the selecting. And we talked about the theory, sexual selection theory, in which we said that the sex that invests the most is going to be the choosiest. Okay? And so it's usually females. One of the spectacular cases of this kind of sexual selection are in bowerbirds. Bowerbirds are down in Australia, and I don't know their full distribution. But males build these bowers, and so they've got this natural material that's woven together. It sometimes is just two separate columns. Sometimes it forms all the way a circle. And then bowerbirds tend to decorate with colored materials, but they pick a particular color. In this bowerbird, it's clearly going to be blue, but in others it could be red or yellow. And people that live in the region of bowerbirds know that these bowerbirds will come to their homes and steal anything that's of that color. And so the males are stealing whatever clothespins or bottle caps or pens or pencils or anything that's that right color. Now the amazing thing is that these bowers that the males are building are not used for nesting. The males are simply put through this routine by the female, who will come over and inspect the bower, and if it's proper, then she'll go on to mate with him. But if it's not built to her satisfaction, she leaves. And there are all sorts of amusing things to see about bowerbirds, and I hope you go on YouTube and investigate this. But one is that male bowerbirds of the same species that are in the same area have been caught as soon as one leaves his bower to go get materials. The other one nearby has been caught stealing materials from the nearby other male's bower. Further, they've been caught destroying the bower of a nearby other male. And so there's intense, get this, there's intense intrasexual selection while there's intersexual selection going on. So the males are fighting with each other to attract females. The males fighting with each other is intrasexual selection, but trying to attract females is intersexual selection. I hope you have a chance to explore on your own, now that you got a little bit more time, to go and learn about bowerbirds. It's just a lot of fun. So, remember the film that we saw at the very end of the zoo semester, what females want and what males will do. And in that film, they explored sexual selection very, very well. And I'm really glad you got to see it. In fact, this year, they may not get to see it. I feel really sad about that for the zoo class. Sexual selection, if it's for physical traits, is likely to lead then to sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism is a clear, apparent difference between the sexes. Okay? Now, I want to say one thing. There may be some color differences in some birds that we can't see, but they can see. I've been reading at a laboratory that is doing studies of the ability to detect ultraviolet light. Now, we cannot see ultraviolet light, but this bird laboratory is saying that they think that all or most birds can see ultraviolet light. And so there may be differences, there may be sexual dimorphism in ways that we cannot detect. Okay? American robins, although there's tends to be in the spring a difference in the size of females who are all filled up with eggs, and the males that might be a little thinner, you might be able to notice that. But I suspect that there's ultraviolet light differences that we could see. Okay? So generally, and we've talked about this, males being showy. We've asked in zoology how on earth that could in fact be a good thing. So if you're really brightly colored, how is that going to help you attract a mate? The question is, how is it adaptive for a male to increase his chances of mating while decreasing his chances of survival? And clearly, that's what's going on here. If there's any predator on male peacocks, I'm thinking that they're going to be very cued in to the display of this male peacock. They're not going to be cued into his smell or his footprints. They're going to look for this gigantic display here. I think there's big displays by male turkeys in Illinois that aren't as elaborate, but certainly would increase the likelihood that a fox or maybe even an eagle or hawk might prey on that male turkey. So, we had wondered in zoology, why do females prefer males who are risking their lives? And briefly, when we discussed this in zoo, we came up with two ideas. One is that the male is advertising by all of this bright coloration and anatomy that he's very, very healthy. And so that might be that he possesses really, really good genes. And so a female that sees a brightly colored male in great condition is a female that's preferring a male that has genes that are well suited to the current environment. That might be the case, and this could be a male from right outside my window right now, in which it's a goldfinch, and it's very, very brightly colored. 6 months from now, if this goldfinch male survives, he's going to be much more drab in color. When you're outside of the breeding season, males lose these showy colors. And so that's a good bit of evidence that suggests that these showy colors are for mating, and that these showy colors are a disadvantage for survival. So when they're not mating, the males go back to a color pattern that's more suited for survival. The second hypothesis, other than a good gene, is simply called the handicap hypothesis. And that says that males that are really, really bright and showy are at greater risk of being preyed upon. And if they still can survive, then they must have some broad set of traits or strategies that helps them to survive. And so females are preferring those males who are somehow able to overcome the handicap. Now, of course, these two hypotheses are actually related because the genes that help you to overcome the handicap may be the good genes that make you healthy and really, really fit. You could predict that a sickly male would not do as well as a well, healthy male. All right, new topic. So it says new topic, and we're near the end here. Genetic variation, we've said, is a good thing. Okay. So what preserves genetic variation? Well, diploidy, having more than one set of genes, is one way that we can preserve variation. I don't know if you'd really thought about this, but you'd have to think about this long and hard. Why have two sets of almost all of your genes? Well, if you go back to that old homozygous heterozygous situation that we talked about, in a heterozygous condition with a dominant trait, what we have is a recessive allele that's not being expressed. What's the advantage of that? Well, it might be that that's an allele that conveys an advantage in rare circumstances. And so it's available, it's in reserve, so that down the road, down the line, there might come a time when it conveys an advantage. But otherwise, it can be hidden, it can be brought along. So you can have a recessive allele without it being expressed. That's what diploidy and the heterozygous condition is allowing. It's really neat. Balancing selection that we talked about, in which we had the brown and the green forms of stink bugs. Balancing selection is another way to maintain diversity, in which the frequency of the traits go back and forth. So, balancing selection may be that in the heterozygous condition, there's some advantage that in the homozygous condition, both homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive are not as good as the heterozygote. Well, what's an example of that? Heterozygote advantage that we've seen before was sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, it's not full-on sickle cell anemia, it's the heterozygous condition, and it somehow conveys or confers malaria resistance. And this is itself, we could spend a whole day on this. A medical scientist went through and who was looking at malaria in Africa and sickle cell anemia and noticing that where we had the highest incidence of, as you can see, sickle cell alleles was also the places that we had the highest incidence of malaria. And you can tell that the equator goes through here, and so it's very warm and wet. And we have lots of malaria, but we also have a lot of the sickle cell allele around. And so we think that sickle cell anemia has persisted in humanity because, not because having sickle cell is an advantage, it isn't, it's a horrible disease. And not having the sickle cell allele, which many of us don't have it, most of us don't have it, we would be in trouble for malaria. We'd be in trouble if we had sickle cell anemia. We'd be in trouble if we have no sickle cell alleles and we're in an area of malaria. Who has an advantage are the carriers, the heterozygous condition. Frequency dependent may also then have to do with the type that I was talking about before. And so that may have to do with stink bugs, or here's another kind of example. There's a fish that trails behind other fish and picks off scales and eats them. This is that fish. He's picking off scales, coming from behind, and eats them. And when this fish comes behind another fish, he can turn to the left and pick the scales, or he can turn to the right and pick the scales, right? He's not going to pick scales off the very end of the tail. He's going to come and pick them off the side of the body. And so, the fish that are being preyed upon have learned to kind of keep their eye to the right and avoid the fish that are coming on the right side, which would actually be the left-mouthed fish. And then when they watch out a lot from the right, well, it turns out the fish from the other side have an advantage. And so in this case, there's diversity that's maintained because there's no one strategy that's going to work out best. It's best if whatever the predator is here, or it's probably more like a parasite in this case, it's going to have different strategies. So the prey is always fighting it off. And there will be times when the right-mouthed or the left-mouthed are favored. Here we can see through the sample year down here the frequency of the right and left mouth. And here it varied back and forth over about a 10-year period of time. And that's pretty neat. So I talked to you about the green and the brown stink bugs. We think the same thing may be true in some snails that have different kinds of color patterns. And so again, as predators are searching for a new kind of search image here, those without that pattern then have an advantage. Then the predators switch the pattern, the search image, and the other pattern emerges. So we think that there may be this kind of distinct difference that's related to the search image, which is what the predator has in the mind's eye for what it's looking for. Reminding you about a search image. If you lost your keys, and many times students leave keys, or they leave a phone in the lecture hall, and then they'll come back in and say, "Did you see my keys?" And I'll say, "Well, tell me something about your keys. Did it have anything attached to it?" Sometimes it's on a big red thing, for example. And so if they said, "Yeah, it's a big red disc, it's about the size of the top of your coffee mug," I'll be looking then, I'll have my eye looking for a big red disc. And that's what I'll be searching for and have in my mind's eye. That's a search image. All right, and now this is some of what's at the very end of the chapter of 23, which says, I believe the title is, Why Natural Selection Cannot Fashion or Lead to Perfect Organisms. For one, selection only acts on what's there. We've talked about this before. So evolution is limited by the history of not only the structures, but also the processes, the DNA that's already in existence. I've made the case that adaptations are often not only compromises, here they say often, I'm going to make the case that they are always compromises. I don't know of an exception, and it's never been pointed out to me. And that there's a role for chance. And so since you could always be really unlucky, it's hard to lead to perfection. Here, they're trying to show you an example of the kinds of interactions that occur in nature and help you realize that though we use simple examples when we think about natural selection, sometimes things are really complicated. Frogs might be out at night calling for a mate, but then bats with a really good sense of hearing might use that. So sexual selection here leading to regular natural selection, predator and prey for that poor frog. So this poor frog is fighting disease, it needs to find food, it's trying to find mates. But for goodness sakes, it's calling for females, and then at the same time a predator may be using those calls to prey upon the poor little critter. So that's chapter 23. Again, we're following closely for the book. Chapter 24 is going to be even more straightforward. I'll have a separate next lecture on that, starting to look at chapter 24. But that's it. So there are 2 lectures. This is the second for chapter 23. And this, again, is on lecture exam 4. Take care, folks. I hope you all stay very, very safe.